This podcast is brought to you by North Carolina's electric cooperatives.
This is NC Spin, an unrehearsed discussion on issues of interest to North Carolinians. Now, here is your moderator, Tom Campbell.
Welcome to Balance Debate for the Old North State. From time to time, we like to take a break from the burning issues of the day and step back and get some broader perspective. And this week, our panel's going to have some interesting conversation around the founding of this nation and our state, where we are today and what we should hope for in the future. Joining us on this week's panel are Becki Gray, Vice President of the John Locke Foundation, John Hood, a syndicated columnist and author, Chris Fitzsimon, political commentator and analyst, and former state senator and chairman of the Board of Education, Howard Lee. Well, we're going to begin our uninterrupted debate after these brief messages by our underwriters.
Life's busy, but you're in control. As an electric cooperative member, you have access to lots of tools to help manage your home energy use and budget, so you can focus on what's most important.
Quality of life enjoyed by North Carolinians comes from the sacrifice of our state and local government retirees. These men and women risked their lives in times of danger. They taught our children, kept our neighborhoods clean, and protected the state's resources. They are North Carolina's silent heroes. The North Carolina Retired Governmental Employees Association proudly serves as the voice for more than 300,000 retirees across North Carolina. Our retirees deserve no less, and every day we stand by them.
Well, let's get to it. Most of us remember the founders who helped give birth to this nation. As I was contemplating the bold risks they took, their patriotic passion and unswerving vision for the future, I asked myself, what would Adams, Jefferson, Franklin, Hamilton, and Washington think of what has come since that July in 1776? I want to ask each of you, if these founders were able to see what's become of what they acknowledged was a bold experiment, what do you think they would say about what they granted? Chris Fitzsimon, let me start with you.
Well, I think they'd be pleased that we still thrive and exist as a democracy that leads the world, even though we have our warts and problems. I think they also, in my view, would think that our leaders need to figure out how to take those fundamental principles and apply them to the changes that have happened in our society. And we'll get into this a little bit later, but I cannot imagine, I couldn't imagine it 20 years ago, the changes in our technology and the role of money and how, just all the things that have happened in our society. And I think we can do that. We can have an evolving, living, breathing constitution and take into account what has really changed since they created the state and country.
Howard Lee, what do you think they would be saying today?
I think overall they would be pleased with the progress we've made. I think they would be proud of the fact that while we do have our discussions and our differences and our fights verbally, that they would be pleased that we no longer have the physical fights that some of them enjoyed or endured while they were putting this nation together. But overall, I think they would think that we've even overcome some of the barriers they put in place, like being completely open and accepting of people of all ethnic groups, and especially the way we've dealt with getting rid of all of the restrictions of slavery.
Yeah. Becki, what would you think they would say?
I agree. I think that they would be very pleased with where we are. You know, the founders were very astute observers of human nature. And I think in the 200 plus years that we've been there, those observations, the factors of human nature have not changed. They've been consistent. I think it was Madison who said in one of the Federalist Papers that men are not angels and that's why we need government. I think that's certainly true today as it was then. I think that they would be pleased with our defense of democracy and where we are and the example that we are. And I think they would be very pleased too that this experiment after 200 plus years has been very successful. If you look at our economy, of what we offer, of the opportunity that is here, I think that they would be pleased with the results of the experiment so far.
John?
Well, I didn't know them personally, perhaps unlike some at the table. So what I would have to say is, hey, ho, hey. So I would have to say, I think that they would not be surprised by the size of our country, actually, because
really?
even in those days, there was a sense that the United States, starting out as 13 states along the eastern seaboard would eventually spread across the continent. That was not unheard of thinking even in Jefferson's day or Adams' day. What I think they would be very surprised by is the population. Being a quarter of a billion people living in a country, that they had a sense that the republic they were creating in the Constitution later and the Declaration of Independence to start the war, to ratify the war with the Crown, they thought that several million people was stretching it. They were concerned that might be too big to sustain self-government. I think they would be surprised. They'd have concerns, and we'll probably talk about those in a little bit, but I think they would be pleasantly surprised that you could have a meaningful self-governing polity that has a quarter of a billion people in it. That would shock them, but I think if they thought about it some, they would become more comfortable with the idea.
I think even further than that, John, you know, we saw the national government formed, we saw the dependence on states, but I think they also might be surprised at the influence and the impact that local governments have had, and that democracy going all the way down to states, counties, cities, municipalities, all the way down the spectrum, that those principles of democracy transfer all the way through every level of government.
Though I think they would be shocked in a negative way. They would be appalled at how little we let states and localities do things.
Yes.
Whether we like this or whether we agree with the founders or not, I think they would almost to a person be fundamentally against the size of the current federal government. They just didn't envision that it would do all the things it currently does.
Yeah, I think they had the attitude that it's the government closest to the people that impacts the lives of the people in the most positive way. And
is most responsive.
And is most responsive to the people.
But I don't disagree with that. What's interesting to me about that is that in some ways it's the federal government, well, in many ways, that has enforced the at least legal equality between people's ethnicities and racism. If we left it up to the states, how long would it have taken Alabama and Mississippi to treat African Americans as full citizens in the United States? I mean, that's the tension there.
I agree with that. That doesn't consume a whole lot of federal resources. I think what they would be, remember,
if you have to send the National Guard to let kids go to school.
Most of what the federal government is a big insurance company that has an army. The vast majority of our expenditures are for Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, and retiree benefits for federal employees. That's the vast majority of what we spend money on, and most of that they would question. So I'm not sure that they would question the expenditure of federal dollars to enforce the constitutional rights against state encroachment. Actually, some of them at least would agree with that, but that's not where the size of the federal government comes from.
Howard touched on this a few minutes ago concerning the fact that it was an imperfect union. They recognized at the time that they hadn't dealt with the issue of slavery, they hadn't dealt with the issue of women's equality, but they made the best decisions and compromises that they could get. Becki, George Washington, in his farewell address, told the assembled Congress and the nation at the time, warned us against excessive partisanship. Do you think the founders would take a look at the climate we've got today and say, we get a great big goose egg on that one?
I think they would be very troubled by that, particularly George Washington. I mean, remember, George Washington was the only independent president we've ever had. He believed that moderation of those ideas and that compromise was very important. And I think that's how we got where we were, was these ideas were put on the table, they were hashed out, they were discussed very passionately in many cases, and coming to solutions that everyone's opinion was equal, and that the decisions that were made represented the good of the people and a good representation of different ideas. And I think this polarization that we have now, I think that would be very troublesome.
Not just partisanship. I think they would be very disappointed in the fact that people dig in based on philosophy and then organize themselves into little rump groups. Like, for example, today we have the Freedom Caucus, or we have the Black Caucus, and we have the Women's Caucus, and it's just all these little groups inside of what was then the political party. And while Washington was concerned that that would break down the ability of people to relate to each other across these different lines, it's even broken down now even farther because people are dug in and they don't want to compromise.
Chris, another one of the founding principles that the founders espoused was because they were so wary of the British monarch, they designed a system of government that had three branches: the executive, the congressional, legislative, and the judiciary. They feared too much power being vested in any one of those branches. Do you think that they would take a look at this and say that the balance of power has swung too far one to the other?
Well, I think there's I don't know. I think that it's ebbed and flowed through our nation's history. I think now we are in a place where I think people on both sides have some questions about the power of the executive over the legislative branch. I think it's ironic that is even true when one party controls the government. I think there's always a battle in North Carolina. We've certainly seen in recent years a battle between the legislative branch trying to have greater control over whether it's a governor or the legislative branch. That's happened also in our history when we've had split governments. So if you take the right now it seems very troubling. I think if you take the long view, part of those battles are inherent in the way they set that up. So I'm not sure that they would be troubled if they take a long view.
But in looking at this, John, is the reason, and I think there is some theory and thinking that perhaps the executive branch has become a little bit more powerful than perhaps was originally envisioned. But is this because of the fact that the legislative branch is essentially in this country today stagnant?
No, it predates that. It really started with Woodrow Wilson, who, when he was an academic, argued that the presidency should be much more powerful and Congress should be depowered. And the progressive movement took up that mantra and moved forward with it. Here's the danger of what we're doing right now. We're talking about the founders would think this, the founders would think that. They were greatly in disagreement about these matters at the time. So we talk about partisanship, for example. Washington wanted to be above party. Even during his presidency, this was more fictional than reality. Partisan politics was invented by John Adams, Thomas Jefferson, and James Madison.
Oh yeah, no question.
So the other founders. And similarly, when it comes to executive power, I'm not sure Alexander Hamilton would be particularly concerned. He wanted a very strong president.
Oh, yes.
James Madison did initially and then wanted a stronger legislative branch later, but then became president, wanted to be strong president, and then changed his mind. And Thomas Jefferson was rather suspicious of executive power. So I think that we would have robust debates among the founders. If the spirits of the founders joined us on this panel, they would start arguing with each other. They wouldn't all have a unanimous conclusion.
You mean you don't think they're here?
Well, they would agree with me, naturally.
Naturally. Howard, Winston Churchill, who was a great fan of America, certainly because they were a champion for him during World War II, said you can always count on America to do the right thing after they've tried everything else. Do you think our founders would say that this is a relatively true statement as they're taking a macro view of what's going on in this country?
Well, I think America has certainly wrestled with itself and certainly had some real challenges trying to overcome some of the obstacles to be fair, equitable, and certainly be right in making decisions. And there have been times when some of us who have been on the receiving end of some of these decisions and actions have doubted that we could ever come through it. But overall, when you actually measure the outcomes, America does rise up when its back is to the wall, and it recognizes that our survival depends on our ability to relate across various lines.
Well, I think it's important to remember, too, that, democracy is messy, and it's loud, and it's controversial, and, we joked earlier about if they were here, they'd probably be out in the parking lot challenging each other to a duel. So, I mean, the whole process is messy, and do we always do the right thing? I like to think that we do. Is that after we've tried everything else? Often, and I'll tell you something else, we've been lucky through the years, and a lot of it is because of the framework that we have. We are willing to take risks, and we're willing to put our neck out there for things that matter, and we're willing to, to really make the hard decisions. And sometimes it's messy to get there, but that's what this is about. It's supposed to be.
I also think that they would be pleased with one outcome. They made a choice that most countries in the world did not make, which is to not have a parliamentary system. They chose something very different from that, purposefully to reduce government activity. To have that, they built in fights, they built in checks and balances. They didn't want the head of state to also be the head of the party in the parliament. That's not what they wanted. They got what they wanted, and frankly, America has been better served than in most parliamentary democracies where things swing back and forth radically in a destructive way.
Chris, I think that the studying that I've done on this, people either operate out of hope or out of fear. By and large, I think it's accurate to say our founders operated out of great hope. Would you agree?
Certainly, I would. I mean, and given the way this country was founded, but I don't want to be the pessimist. I think, or be the naysayer, because I agree with everything that's been said. But and Howard referenced it earlier. I do think we have to remember the things that they didn't do. They didn't think of African Americans as human beings. They didn't think women should vote. They thought property should be a qualification to vote. Thank goodness we have changed all those things. But I often think of those things when people they were human beings. They weren't divine, inspirational people that were put on this earth by a higher being. They made huge, dramatic, tragic mistakes, especially with slavery, the country's original sin. So when people say the founders were perfect and decided everything the way it should be, they didn't. But they did set up a system where we could change it. And I wish we were changing some things faster. I wish it hadn't taken us so long to guarantee people equal rights and a lot of the other things. So I don't want to I don't want to act like everything was perfect when they set everything up.
One of the historians that I read said if America had a creed, the creed would be liberty, self-government, and equality. Agree or disagree, Becki?
I think not only would it be, I think it is. I think that is our creed in America, and I think that there is more opportunity here than there is anywhere else in the world, and it's because of the work that the founders did. It's the work that has been done through the years, and it's work of leaders right here in North Carolina, like Howard Lee and other people who have really made America and our state. I'm particularly proud of being a North Carolinian. What it is. I think that is our creed.
I would say though, I mean, to take Chris's point and apply it to that, I think that is our creed. I also think that America has a history of not living up to its principles, just like any other country. Here's the point about that. I would rather have hypocrites than corrupt crooks. In other words, even back in the founding era, the principles that these individuals espoused should have led them to be abolitionists. It should have led them to, now it often did not, because they didn't live up to their principles. But it's still better to have principles you don't live up to than to have no principles. And I think we have a creed that is powerful and inspiring, even if we don't always live up to it.
Howard, do you think they would be concerned about the recent trends toward nationalism and isolationism in this country?
It's hard to make a definitive statement on that, but I certainly think that they recognize that America needed to be a strong and model country after which others could pattern themselves. And through the years, I think we have moved more toward becoming a nationalistic relating entity. But I'm not sure the founders themselves envisioned America being the kind of a national model that we've had. And I'm not sure that they would have been upset if we had been kind of America first.
Well, we've been through these periods before where we've been isolationist. Gosh, we were the world's peacekeeper after World War II and helped to reestablish the economy, not only in America, but throughout the rest of the world. You have to believe they would look at this and have some degree of admiration for us. But not nearly so well known, but equally important, were the founders of North Carolina. And those names include men like Caswell and Blunt, Davie, Nash, Martin, and they helped guide and shape this new state in its formative years. Let's assume we could converse with them today and ask their possible reactions on the North Carolina of today. John Hood, what would the North Carolina founders say about our state today?
They would be surprised that North Carolina is as large, as populous as it is, as much of an economic engine as it is, because in their day, North Carolina was not unpopulated. It had a lot of people in it, but over a large state, it was fairly low density, small towns, didn't have the same kind of infrastructure and national prominence that South Carolina and Virginia had. And I think they would be pleasantly surprised that North Carolina is now more populous than either of those states, and frankly, politically more important than either of those states.
Chris, we like to boast we were first in freedom between the Mecklenburg Declaration and the Halifax Resolves. What do you think our founders would say about us and freedom today?
Well, that depends on how you define that word, I think. There are a lot of ways to define it. I think that in general, the founders of North Carolina have a lot in common. Maybe they're not as well known as the founders of the country. They obviously patterned North Carolina was part of the Union. We had that, when we were part of the South and seceded. I'm not sure they could have envisioned that. Wish that had happened, that we had resolved that, as I mentioned before. What also is interesting to me, the two things I wanted to say, and it applies to both the state and federal constitution. I think they would be alarmed, and maybe everybody wouldn't be alarmed, at the vast power that wealth has over our democracy, the extent to which some people on both sides control the political debate and the political discourse. And I think as the media shrinks, it's even harder for average folks to have their views heard. The other interesting thing to me is when I first started reading the Constitution a long time ago, I was always struck that a qualification in North Carolina to run for office was a belief in God. That was actually struck down, but it's still in our Constitution. So I think the whole role of religion in public life is a fascinating one that I think our founders probably couldn't have envisioned.
Becki, we've got a reputation in North Carolina as being a stubborn people. We wouldn't ratify
a stubborn panel.
That too.
We are an accurate representation of North Carolina.
I mean, we wouldn't ratify the Constitution because it didn't have a Bill of Rights. You talked about secession and the Civil War. We really did not want to get into the Civil War, but sort of got dragged into it because of our neighbors. Do you think our founders would admire our stubborn streak?
I would classify
and
it
as... And is it still prevalent?
I would not say stubborn. I would say thoughtful. And I think that you see that every day at the General Assembly, a lot of the discussions, certainly discussions around this table with thought leaders. You know, stubborn is one thing, but not just being willing to go with it. That's different than, you know, really taking a step back, not being afraid to not go with the crowd, to really make those thoughtful decisions. I think that's what makes North Carolina unique.
And our motto, of course, for the state is esse quam videre, to be rather than to seem. You think that is still true today, John?
I think North Carolina has had a long history of saying the state motto and meaning exactly the opposite. You know, a lot of people who proclaim loudly and constantly how humble they are and North Carolina is. Those are sort of the opposite of being humble. So North Carolina, I wish that creed had better applied to North Carolina's history, but oftentimes it was more ironic than real.
We have bragged about being a valley of humility. But never
you don't say that unless you are pretty much the opposite of humble.
There you go. During various points in our time, Howard, we have been either known as the Rip Van Winkle State or the Dixie Dynamo. You think either of both apply to us today?
I think some of both applies to us. Certainly there have been eras in our state when you thought we were asleep and didn't know what in the world was going on. But on the other hand, we have certainly shown remarkable ability to be progressive, forward-looking, and to be successful.
Well, America's always been the place where people came for a better life, and following World War II, we assumed the leadership role in the world, unknown in the modern era, but many are questioning whether we even can or want to continue that role. I want to ask each of you, how would you describe the overall mood of people today? Are we still optimistic about the future, willing to accept challenges, understanding that we'll do better when we help other nations succeed, or have we become a country where we're tired of leading and don't want to pay a disproportionate share of the support of the rest of the world? Chris?
Well, I think it's our country is literally wrestling with those questions now. That is fundamentally one of the 2 or 3 biggest public debates that we're facing with the Trump administration, and I think many in the Republican Party who are uncomfortable with him, certainly the Democrats are. I always feel like the America First slogan in some ways becomes America Only when it's sort of translated into the popular vernacular, and that's just not true. I'm not talking about militarily. I'm talking about on trade. I'm talking about on helping folks who are in need. You know, nobody thinks we should. I don't know anybody who advocates open borders, but when people are fleeing, our country has always rushed to sort of help people and figure out a way to have them become integrated in our society. So those questions are literally the debate we're having in America today.
Elder, comments on that?
Well, I think we certainly are experiencing our greatest challenge on how to respond in that regard. I frankly think America has to be the beacon light for hope for
Shining
the
city
world.
on the hill.
And if we retreat from that, and as far as the president is concerned, we need a president who is a unifying force and not a disruptive force.
Becki, one of the things that is fairly obvious to me as I'm taking a macro view of this is that people have lost trust in government and elected top politicians. Is that genie just out of the bottle, not to be returned, or do you think we can restore trust in our government?
Absolutely.
So what's it going to take?
Well, it's going to take elections. It's going to take good people to run. It's going to take, and you know, Tom, the other thing is, I think that we all need to assume a responsibility for our democracy, for our way of life, for what we have, and that goes to participating in elections, reading, finding out what candidates stand for. What do you want North Carolina to be? What do you want your district to be? What do you want America to be? Pay attention to those and participate in the voting process. But just real quick, I want to say too, you know, as far as America's position in the world, the Fraser Institute is an organization that does this worldwide look at freedom. And when you see the map of the world that they put out and where freedom is the most vibrant and where it's not, that's where a lot of the immigrants are trying to get to. People are trying to get to freedom, and that's what we represent across the world.
We got 30 seconds left. Very quickly, final word on the subject of North Carolina and America today.
America is naturally going to be the leader. We are just poorly served by our current leaders.
Interesting. Good points.
But we'll get back to that. To being a world leader, yes.
You're hopeful for that. Well, we hope you've enjoyed this special edition of NC Spin and that we've given you something to think about. Next week, we return to our regular format of balanced debate for the Old North State. Stay informed all during the week, give your feedback, and read my weekly column. Be sure to visit our website or catch NC Spin on Facebook. Until next week, stay informed and watch out for the spin.
Life's busy, but you're in control. As an electric cooperative member, you have access to lots of tools to help manage your home energy use and budget, so you can focus on what's most important.
Quality of life enjoyed by North Carolinians comes from the sacrifice of our state and local government retirees. These men and women risked their lives in times of danger. They taught our children, kept our neighborhoods clean, and protected the state's resources. They are North Carolina's silent heroes. The North Carolina Retired Governmental Employees Association proudly serves as the voice for more than 300,000 retirees across North Carolina. Our retirees deserve no less, and every day we stand by them.
North Carolina Channel is made possible by the financial contributions of viewers like you who support the UNC TV network.